Right. Okay, I can just about see. Because I have got a script, because I find it's quite an efficient way of doing a lecture. But before I begin, I did want to say a little bit about why being here means so much to me. As you just heard, I actually was a student at St. Cuthbert's Society, and I think in a very significant sense, St. Cuthbert's, St. Cuth's and Durham University opened the door to where I am now. So I came to this country in 1961 as a boy with very few words of English, and in 1964 I sat and failed my 11 plus. So I went to a school. In those days we used to call it secondary modern. I think probably called comprehensive or something else nowadays. And it didn't actually do any what we used to call GCEs, now GCSEs and so on. But they started introducing them just as I began to move through the school year by year. And so I actually did do my public exams there, and thought about going to university. So this was 1970 now. My teachers, a few of whom had gone to university themselves, couldn't advise me. So when I said, well, what about Durham University? Because I managed to get myself a job, a task, as being what was called a careers librarian. So we had a kind of careers room with loads of brochures about hairdressing and things like that. And I started writing off to universities and asking for their prospectuses. And so I got one from Durham University. It looked so attractive. And of course it is so attractive here. So I said, what about this? None of my teachers had ever heard of it. But I decided to apply and put it at the top of my, what in those days I think we called UCA forms, I think now UCAS. And St. Cuth's picked up my application. It was in relation to philosophy and politics, and I came here, was interviewed and so on. And they offered me a place, and then I didn't get the grades that they asked me to get. And so they said, okay, well, never mind. You can come along and you can do, I don't know whether you have it still, you can do a general degree. So not an honours degree, but a general degree, and not just specialising in two subjects like philosophy and politics. So I did get here after all, and actually I was people often say they're the first person in their family to go to university, and actually that's not true of me, but I was the first person from my school to go to university. And of course I'm so grateful for that decision, which very much reflected the philosophy of St. Cuth's, which was a pioneer in what we now would call widening participation. And I did go on to actually do philosophy and politics honours. After the first year you could move up. And then I was here an extra year and did a master's in political theory. And despite the fact that in my 4 years here, I never studied anything to do with race, ethnicity, Muslims or Islamophobia, not even any sociology, my time at Durham and what I was taught here has actually strongly shaped how I later went on to study the kinds of topics I'm about to speak on. The philosophy department introduced me to Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the politics department introduced me to Michael Oakeshott. And they've both profoundly influenced, at a philosophical level, my approaches as a sociologist and to the interdisciplinary way in which I practice sociology. So this is the title. It was not very long ago that Anglophone scholars of racism understood it in terms of biology, and specifically in terms of the black-white binary. At the same time, other scholars, especially in continental Europe, understood racism in terms of anti-Semitism. especially in the recent biologized forms that Europe has manifested. When it began to be clear that these two paradigms were failing to capture some contemporary experiences, such as anti-Asian cultural racism in Britain or anti-Arab cultural racism in France, some scholars began to move away from these paradigms. Yet, following the assertive Muslim agency triggered off by the novel The Satanic Verses and other Muslim controversies, as Muslims responded to such hostilities and articulated their misrecognition, they were constantly told, especially in Britain, that there's no such thing as anti-Muslim racism because Muslims are a religious group and not a race. Hence, Muslims could legitimately ask for toleration and religious pluralism, but not for inclusion in anti-racist egalitarian analyses and initiatives. While this view continues to be expressed even today, and some deny that there is a racism that could be labelled Islamophobia, it no longer has the hegemony it once had. The origins of the term Islamophobia have been variously traced to an essay by two French Orientalists, that's one origin, to a neologism of the 1970s, that's another, to an early 1990s American periodical, that's to another, and indeed even to an article of mine. But I actually know I didn't invent the term. But according to Google and other searches, I have two publications in 1990, and they are the sixth and the seventh use of the term in the English language. So, but I actually don't know where I got the term from. And to begin with, I tried to avoid using it because I didn't think it would capture what I really thought was the issue. But anyway, I do use it now, and here I am to tell you what I understand by it. What is less disputed is that the term received, and this has already been referred to, the term received its public policy prominence with the Runnymede Trust's Commission on British Muslims and Islamophobia in 1997, which defined it as, I quote, an unfounded hostility towards Islam and therefore fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. While a number of Anglophone authors, including myself, started using the concept of Islamophobia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was the Runnymede Trust's 1997 report which launched the career of the term as a concept in public discourse in Britain and much beyond it. While the report was groundbreaking and played a crucial role in getting people to think about anti-Muslim prejudice, I felt it did not sufficiently locate Islamophobia as a racism, like, say, anti-Semitism. I continued to write about Islamophobia as a form of what I call cultural racism. That is to say, which may be built on racism based on physical appearance, like colour racism, but was a form of racism in its own right. Again, like anti-Semitism. This also became the approach of UNESCO, and I'm pleased to see that it has been explicitly embraced by the new 2017 Runnymede Trust report called Islamophobia, a Challenge for Us All. So in this talk, I want to bring together 5 propositions. So no suspense, I'm going to tell you what they are and then just go through them one by one. So here are 3 of them. Islamophobia is a form of othering or cultural racism, amongst other things. Secondly, a racialized group cannot be reduced to a race. Thirdly, critique of othering or Islamophobia presupposes non-othered knowledge of the other. Well, actually, that's not true. That says something else, doesn't it? Oh, yeah. Actually, Maybe I got the wrong order here. Right. So, looks like that 3 and 4 I repeat here. No, I don't. So anyway, just to repeat that then, critique of othering presupposes a normative framework which needs to be justified. But look, that's what I say for 4 as well. So I'll tell you what 3 is. It is critique of othering, or Islamophobia, presupposes non-othered knowledge of the other. And so these are a little bit of a mouthful. I will explain them, or try. And then the last one, Islamophobia can be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Islam and Muslims. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the first one, which is Islamophobia is a form of othering or cultural racism. It's a form of cultural racism because while the perception and treatment of Muslims clearly has religious and cultural dimensions, it equally clearly bears a physical appearance. It has a physical appearance or ancestral component. For while it is true that Muslim is not a biological category in the way that, say, black or South Asian or Chinese is, neither is Jew. In the case of the racialization of Jews, it took a long non-linear history to turn an ethno-religious group into a race. More precisely, the latter did not so much as replace the former, but superimposed itself, because even though no one denied that Jews were a religious community with a distinctive language or languages, culture or cultures, and religion, Jews still came to be seen as a race and with horrific consequences. So just because a group can be described as a race, it doesn't mean it's not a religious community. The two things are very compatible, as I'm trying to say has been the case in the history of the Jews. Similarly, Bosnian Muslims were ethnically cleansed because they came to be identified as a racial group. That is to say, as having a perceived line of descent by people who actually were phenotypically, linguistically, and culturally the same as themselves. So the people who were saying to Bosnian Muslims, you need to get out of here, be ethnically cleansed, actually had so much of what we would think of as racial and cultural similarities, but they nevertheless made the Bosnian Muslims into a separate race, a race that didn't belong here, had to go somewhere else. The ethnic cleanser, unlike an inquisitor, wasted no time in finding out what people believed, if and how often they went to a mosque, and so on. Their victims were racially identified as Muslims in terms of membership based on a perceived line of descent. So that's why I say we can talk about the racialization of Muslims. It's not that they don't have a religion, it's because the way that they're identified by the people who racialize them doesn't depend upon faithful interpretation of any particular scripture or practice or anything like that. Race, then, as I understand it, is not just about biology or even colour. For while racialization has to pick on some features of a people related to physical appearance and ancestry, yes, so physical appearance and ancestry does come into the process, because otherwise racism can't be distinguished from other forms of groupism, like, say, sexism. Physical appearance need only be a marker and not necessarily denote a form of determinism. So if you like, in old-fashioned classical biological racism, the physical appearance, or if you like, the genetics, is supposed to determine how a people behave. But I'm saying, well, that's not the only form of racism that we have. The physical appearance is a marker of picking out a group, of saying who's in and outside the group, but it doesn't say anything about how they'll behave. That is to say, the physical appearance or the biology doesn't say anything about how they'll behave. We normally refer to other things like community or fanaticism or something like that. So this is illustrated in the conceptualization of cultural racism as a two-step process. While biological racism is the antipathy, exclusion, and unequal treatment of people on the basis of their physical appearance or other imputed physical differences, saliently in Britain their non-whiteness, cultural racism builds on biological racism a further discourse which evokes cultural differences from an alleged British or civilized norm to vilify, marginalize, or demand cultural assimilation from groups who may also suffer biological racism. Post-war racism in Britain has been simultaneously culturalist and biological, and while the latter is essential to the racism in question, it is in fact the less explanatory aspect of a complex phenomenon. Biological interpretations have not governed what white British people, including racists, have thought or done, how they've stereotyped, treated, and related to non-whites. And biological ideas have had increasingly less force both in the context of personal relationships and in the conceptualization of groups. As white people's interactions with non-white individuals increased, they did not become necessarily less conscious of group differences, but they were far more likely to ascribe group differences to upbringing, customs, forms of socialization, and self-identity than to biological heredity. The interesting question arises as to whether it could be, so I'm saying there's a kind of a two-step racism, a biological and then a cultural. The interesting question arises whether it could be a one-step racism. Could color racism decline and fade away, and yet cultural racism, seeing a descent-based people as culturally other, remain and perhaps even grow? Just a piece of speculation. I don't think that's like where we are today or likely to be in the near future. Cultures and cultural practices are usually internally diverse. Internally diverse, I mean to a group, containing and omitting various authentic elements and adaptations and mixes. To racially group all Jews catches most, if not all, cultural minorities in that targeted group, because obviously Jews can be quite different from each other, but to construct them as a racial group is to try and capture them all. And so similarly, a non-religious Muslim might still be targeted as a cultural Muslim or Muslim by community. Well, what does that mean? That means Muslim by background, which means birth and ancestry. So that's why, as it were, race and descent are still doing quite a lot of the work, just as they do in the case of Jews. Hence my point that Muslims, no less than Jews, are identified racially and not simply in terms of religious beliefs or behavior. Moreover, if we accept that racism does not necessarily involve attributing qualities which inhere in a deterministic law-like way in all members of a group, then we do not have to rule out cultural racism as an example of racism. As such, we should guard against the characterization of racism as a form of what's sometimes called inherentism, some quality inherent in people, or biological determinism, which leaves little space to conceive the ways in which cultural racism draws upon physical appearance as one marker amongst others. So that was the first point, just to go back there. So this is what Islamophobia is a form of othering or cultural racism, okay? So that's what I wanted to say about that. I turn to number 2. A racialized group cannot be reduced to a race. While understanding some contemporary treatment of Muslims and aspects of their societal status in terms of racialization clearly is an advance, we should beware that the conceptualization of Muslims in the West is not reduced to racialization or any other othering theoretical frame, such as Orientalism, like Edward Said's Orientalism, or any other kind of othering frame. By definition, othering sees a minority in terms of how a dominant group negatively and stereotypically imagines that minority as something other, as inferior or threatening, and to be excluded. Indeed, the dominant group typically projects its own fears and anxieties onto the minority. Minorities, however, are never merely projections of dominant groups, but have their own subjectivity and agency through which they challenge how they are perceived, or more to the point, misperceived, and seek to not be defined by others, but to supplant negative and exclusionary stereotypes with positive and prideful identities. Oppressive misrecognitions thus sociologically imply and politically demand recognition. Recognition meaning some understanding of the group, how it sees itself, not just how it's seen by a dominant group, how it's, as it were, misseen, misperceived or misrecognized. Our analyses, therefore, should be framed in terms of a struggle for recognition, a group trying to get itself properly recognized. I don't actually say much about recognition. I've written a fair bit about it elsewhere, so I'm just kind of hoping that just referring to it will do enough work in this particular talk. But very briefly, I borrow the term from Charles Taylor. Hope some of you recognize that anyway. And so recognition means allowing people to adapt and express and grow their own identities, as opposed to have their identities created and shaped by other people, usually by dominant groups. And these identities, I'm not just talking about some kind of purist identities, though Charles Taylor does talk about authenticity. I personally don't, because these can be mixed identities, like being Black British or British Muslims. I'm not talking about pure identities. And the identities, as I say, can be part of something larger than just one identity. Like, of course, you can be an Arab Muslim, but you can be a British Arab Muslim. So it's not a matter of a singular identity, and it's not a matter of a purist identity. I suppose I have a number of differences with Charles Taylor's use of recognition. I won't try and go into all of them here, but one I suppose is worth knowing, because it's if I don't make this point, you may read what I'm saying differently to how I mean it, is that Charles Taylor uses quite a psychological language about recognition to do with people's psyche and hurting people in terms of hurting their feelings and so on. I'm trying to use it in a de-psychologized way. So I'm much more concerned with people's civic status, recognizing people as fellow citizens, but as not just in terms of their individual identities, as members of a group who are fellow citizens. So it certainly includes feelings and subjectivities, such as rejection and acceptance, but at a societal level. So I'm interested in societal recognition and misrecognition, not issues about personal or psychological identity. So I'll just say that, but on the whole, I'm not going to say much here about recognition, say much more about Islamophobia. Recognition, of course, does not mean thinking of Muslims as a group with uniform attributes or a single mindset, all having the same view on religion, personal morality, politics, the international world order, and so on. In this respect, Muslims are just like any other group. They cannot be understood in terms of a single essence and a single set of qualities that all members of the group have to possess in order to be a member of the group. No one in the social sciences thinks that identities are based on cognitive or behavioral properties that are shared by all who may be members of a relevant group, such as women, black people, gay and lesbians, and so on. If group members do not share a common essence, then they cannot be simply demarcated from non-group members, because there will be many cases where individuals are not simply on one side of the boundary or the other. So groups cannot have discrete nor indeed fixed boundaries, as these boundaries may vary across time and place, across social contexts, and will be the subject of social construction and social change. So in the social sciences, what I've just said, not original to me at all. I'm actually trying to express what I think is the consensus, if not the orthodoxy in social sciences. This is often referred to as anti-essentialism. I don't think of groups in terms of possessing a common essence, so I share that view myself. This anti-essentialism is rightly deployed in the study of Islamophobia and Muslims. It is a powerful way of handling ascriptive discourses, of showing that various popular or dominant ideas about Muslims, just as in the case of women, gays and so on, are not true as such, but are aspects of socially constructed images that have been made to stick onto those groups of people because the ascribers are more powerful than the ascribed. Anti-essentialism is an intellectually compelling idea and a powerful resource in the cause of equality. It is also common, though, for authors to accuse each other of essentialism. Despite my saying this is the orthodoxy, it's just slightly balmy, but social scientists love pointing out that they're anti-essentialists, but other social scientists or theorists are not. This is because there are different versions of anti-essentialism, so perhaps it's not so balmy. To pave the way for my third and fourth propositions, I want to briefly rehearse two interpretations which I discussed in my book, Multiculturalism. The first is the skeptical interpretation that the critique kills the groups as real entities and they only live on as ascriptions or reactions to ascriptions or political make-believe. Must have some water. So I hope you recognize that. For instance, I got quote here from Rogers Brubaker, a very eminent American sociologist. He argues that, I quote, "Ethnicity, race and nation are not things in the world, but perspectives on the world, ways of seeing, interpreting and representing the social world." End of quote. One way to interpret this claim might be to conclude that there is something false, fictitious, and illegitimate about appeals to culture, ethnicity, and so on in understanding oneself, let alone others or society, because if these things don't exist, something illegitimate in appealing to them. Stuart Hall, I'm sure you've all come across his work at some point or other. Stuart Hall's words sometimes lend themselves to this radical conclusion. I quote, "If we feel we have a unified identity, it is only because we construct a comforting story or narrative of the self about ourselves. The fully unified, completed, secure, and coherent identity is a fantasy." End of quote. Skeptics do not necessarily want to kill off worthwhile political projects around, say, a black identity or feminism. And so some allow for something called strategic essentialism, where pretending that there is a black or national identity is permitted because of the politics, but analysts know that these identities are only necessary fictions. I think, however, groups are not just strategically but conceptually necessary to both social science and to anti-racism or egalitarian politics. And so I offered an alternative interpretation of anti-essentialism. I suggested that Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance offers a way of recognizing that just as it does not make sense to say that games or languages do not exist because they do not share a common definitional essence, so the lack of group essences and discrete bounded populations with unchanging characteristics, the lack of those things, was not a good reason to assert in an a priori way that groups did not exist. Rather, we had to have a more flexible, looser, and variable notion of a group and group membership that allowed for open texture and overlapping boundaries and overlapping memberships. If it seems difficult to reconcile this with our a priori concept of group, let us call the entities groupings or something else. It doesn't really matter what we call them as long as we don't give up the idea. The idea that groups exist. They're not just a fiction. The key point was that once we stopped demanding that groups measure up to our impossible definitions, we would lose the temptation to conclude that groups suffered from an ontological deficiency, that they were merely, to quote Brubaker, perspectives upon the world, ontologically no superior to the products of othering, to the products of racialization or projections. Another way of putting it is that just as the complete self-made individual of some liberal theories does not exist, it does not follow that individuals do not exist, that we have to give up individual from social science vocabularies. So similarly with groups. So that was the second proposition. My third proposition, which I see that I haven't got accurately down there, is critique of othering presupposes non-othered knowledge of the other. The value of othering as a way of studying minorities is that it can be used to challenge blanket generalizations about a minority. Othering sometimes takes the form of attributing certain features to a group which are alleged to be found in all members of the group. All blacks are muggers, all Muslims are fanatics, and so on. Theorists of racialization typically add that even when no explicit biological ideology is in play, these generalizations are being asserted by the racists in a quasi-naturalistic way. That is to say, that like the laws of nature, they brook no exceptions. The problem with this is that it's an implausible analysis of racialized thinking. Racists often do admit of counterexamples. My best friend is black and no mugger, and if only all blacks could be like that, but alas they're not. Moreover, these racialized statements, which identify groups on the basis of their physical appearance, are not necessarily seeking biological or natural bases for the racialized generalizations. The racializer is unlikely to believe that black mugging and Muslim fanaticism is genetic, and much more likely to think that it is something to do with upbringing, family structure, community norms, etc. In short, what we might call culture, in the manner of cultural racism that I've already described. Yes, the concept of othering has the power to point that out to racists, that their generalizations do not hold of every member of the putative race, that their thinking suffers from quasi-naturalism or essentializes a group. However, all the racist has to do to escape the critique is to say that they're not talking about all members, but some members, or many members, or most members, or more precisely, of more members than is true for other groups or society as a whole. So to make effective the anti-racist critique, one needs to engage with probabilistic statements. And that means relating it to what is known or can be researched empirically about the population in question. More fundamentally, the question that my discussion here raises is, when a dominant group attributes certain characteristics to a subordinate group, how do we work out which of those characteristics that are meant to constitute the otherness of the minority is an imagined and malign projection onto the minority, and which is a genuine feature of cultural difference? Another way of putting this is that the analysis of othering is not a self-sufficient intellectual perspective or disciplinary inquiry. For example, as in Orientalism, or what we might call anti-racism studies. It is dependent on an inquiry into the group as such, not just its othering. Put it this way. If we knew nothing about Muslims, we would have no way of knowing when they were being othered. So when we come across Islamophobic statements, we only know they're Islamophobic because we know something about Muslims. If we knew nothing about Muslims, how would we ever work out that the statement was Islamophobic? I say a little bit more about how these two things interact, the two things being how groups are and how groups are racialized. Well, in many ways, I don't think that's all that original. Most people will accept that there will be an interaction, and so I'm going to leave that bit out, and also I think that's a better use of time. So I turn to my proposition 4. Critique of othering presupposes a normative framework which needs to be justified. Othering nearly always identifies the group in question in terms of negative features. These can take many different forms. Some of the most common are to do with having lower intelligence, less capable of disciplined, responsible behavior, and with a propensity for criminal or violent behavior. In relation to Muslims, some of the negative traits are an obsession with religion over other aspects of life, moral conservatism, especially in relation to sexuality, patriarchy, tendency to act on religion or politics in extreme and violent ways. I'm sure that'll be all very familiar. Analysis of othering is clearly an important tool when it can be deployed to show the operation of these negative perceptions in the media, in news reports, in political discourses, and the way public concerns are raised and expressed. For example, in relation to radicalization or women's dress, and also in television program content, in the activities of the security services, and so on. There is, however, a limitation to such analyses of othering or racialization. Namely, that sometimes there's a lack of agreement between those doing the othering and those being othered about whether certain features are necessarily negative. Most people will agree that to describe a group as less intelligent is to have said something negative about it. But is this the case with religious strictness or moral conservatism? Here it is possible that the dominant group may take one view of the matter, namely that such attitudes and behaviors are negative and backward, but the minority, that is to say substantial numbers within the minority, may refuse that such characterizations are negative. So they don't refuse the characterizations, they refuse that the characterizations are negative. So they say, oh, but you Muslims, you take religion so seriously, you know, loosen up and so on. And Muslims turn around and say, you're right, we do. But what's wrong with that? In recent years, we've seen this most starkly in Europe, in the dominant society's view that wearing the hijab, the headscarf, or the burqa, the head-to-toe garment, or the niqab, the face mask, that all these things by Muslim women is a sign of oppression. Despite the dominant society delivering this judgment through the popular and intellectual media, the numbers of women engaged in such practices has increased. And the increase has been accompanied by the women in question saying that they're choosing to don such clothes out of choice and not as compliance with the demands of Muslim men. To accept, to qualify, or to resist such Muslim women's perspective is not just a matter of empirical inquiry, but invokes a normative framework. In recent years, aspects of feminism and liberalism, what's sometimes referred to as Western feminism, and to use David Cameron's phrase, muscular liberalism, have been cynically and insincerely used to critique and undermine various Muslim practices and claims for accommodation, including issues of women's dress. However, not all such appeals have to be cynical or insincere. They can be principled and reasonable. Without trying to spell out in any detail the sincere and insincere versions, though I do have a go in my fifth proposition, but at this moment, without trying to spell out in any detail the different versions of these highly complex and varied isms, I'm simply making the point that some such normative framework is necessary. So it doesn't matter what that framework is, but some normative framework is necessary. So in order to say Muslim women are being oppressed, you must have some normative framework. You just can't say, oh, this was my sociological research. An analysis of othering, for example, how the fact of living within a hegemonic secularism subtly influences Muslim subjectivity, is incomplete without an appeal to a normative framework, for without that, we cannot know to what extent the influence is a result of an exercise of self-interested power, of domination, and to what extent it is an aspect of benign social change on the part of Muslims themselves, who on a reasoned basis come to adapt their practices and modify their sense of what it means to be a Muslim. To stick with my earlier example, to argue that the hijab or niqab or burqa are or are not a form of oppressive othering is not just a matter of empirical inquiry or discourse analysis, but implicitly or explicitly appeal to how to distinguish between what is negative and what is positive in the characterization of Muslims. If it is implicit, it needs to be made explicit. Either way, the normative presuppositions need to be questioned. That is to say, they cannot be taken for granted, but stand in need of argument and justification. Without such justification, not only may an analysis of othering be incomplete or distorted, but may itself be an exercise in othering, namely in seeing groups in question as prejudicially othered, as for example religious conservatives, i.e. thinking of them that if they're religious conservatives, they're being othered. That's what I mean by prejudicially othered. You decide that, oh, if they're religiously conservatives, that must be as a product not of Muslims themselves, but someone else sticking that label or description upon them. So seeing the groups in question as prejudicially othered, when that is exactly how the group may wish to think of itself and to be respected for being as such. So this will, of course, be an empirical matter, i.e. whether the group does think that or doesn't think that. This will, of course, be an empirical matter. Hence my earlier point that critique of othering presupposes empirical knowledge of the other. But depending on the facts, it may also be a refusal to accept the group on its own terms. That may not be wrong as such. My point is that to accept or not to accept will require a normative argument. And so a perspective such as, Edward Said's Orientalism or anti-Islamophobia are incomplete without normative argument. And I just make that point because Edward Said says he doesn't want to offer a normative argument, and others who work within his frame. So the kind of normative disavowal that one finds in, offering another example, that one finds in the influential work of, say, Talal Asad is misplaced. He's been a powerful force for getting us to rethink secularism, but his conceptual framework does not explicitly help us to determine whether secularism is a good thing or which version of secularism is better than another. Or to put it another way, everyone will agree that Islamophobia must be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Muslims and aspects of Islam. But not only is this a difficult question to make, but it begs the question, what are reasonable criticisms that Muslims and non-Muslims may make or discuss in relation to some Muslim views about, say, gender or education or secularism? Not only must the study of Islamophobia not squeeze out the possibility of such discussion, but by showing us where it becomes Islamophobic, it should help to guide us onto the terrain of reasonable dialogue. Merely identifying the unreasonable and the populist is not enough. Our frames of analysis should lead us to the reasonable, to what criticisms may be made of Muslims and or Islam, and what criticisms that Muslims want to make of contemporary Western societies, too, are worthy of hearing. The minority in question must be able to negotiate, modify, accept criticism, and change in its own way. A dialogue must be distinguished from a one-sided imposition. Islamophobia should therefore be studied within a normative framework and not just one that exposes the normative presupposition of others while evading the challenge of justifying one's own normative presuppositions. So my own framework, what I call multiculturalism or a struggle for recognition and institutional accommodation, prioritizes groups fighting negative outsider perceptions by giving normative and political weight to insider identifications in all their plurality. But I won't say more about that, though of course you may ask me about it. I'll just go on to my last point, and this bit's the most recent that I've been thinking about in relation to Islamophobia, so perhaps it's a little bit more not fully tightened up and so on, so very happy to discuss that with you. Islamophobia can be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Islam and Muslims. Yet how, it may be asked, are we to distinguish reasonable criticism from Islamophobia? Take this proposition. Muslim views about women are oppressive and not appropriate for modern Britain. Is this Islamophobia or reasonable criticism? My suggestion is that we should apply the following 5 tests. 1. Does it stereotype Muslims by assuming they all think and do the same? Does the criticism seem to suggest that all or most Muslims have this blameworthy characteristic, whatever it might be, and that this feature defines Muslims, indeed drowns out any worthy characteristics and ignores contextual factors. Okay, my second test. Is it about Muslims or part of a dialogue with Muslims which they would wish to join? Does the mode of criticism consist of generalizing about a group in a way that tends to exclude them rather than treat them as conversational partners who share common concerns? Third test. Is mutual learning possible? For example, one may criticize some Muslims for sexual conservatism or Puritanism, but is one willing to listen to those Muslims who think that contemporary societies like Britain are over-sexualized and encourage sexually predatory and undignified behavior? And of course, in the current, post-Harvey Weinstein Me Too climate, this is quite apposite. So that's, I got other examples there, haven't I? Older women in schooling. I won't go into those details unless you ask me later. But I hope you get the point anyway. So my fourth test. Is the language civil and contextually appropriate? Is the behavior or practice being criticized in an offensive way and seems to make Muslims the target rather than stick to the issue? So I offer an analogy here. I say compare criticism in relation to Israel and anti-Semitism. So I think how reasonable you can have reasonable contextual criticism of Zionism, and we know, and there are plenty of instances, that it can become a diatribe against people as such. There are instances, and we can Google and find plenty of them. But it doesn't mean that we can't make reasonable criticisms of Zionism. Lastly, insincere criticism for ulterior motives. Does the person doing the criticism really care about the issue, or rather is using it to attack Muslims? And I think I give an example here. Two examples I give here is it's interesting how in quite a few countries now, including this one, and we see this in the United States, in continental Europe, that some very right-wing, in fact quite anti-Semitic groups, white supremacist groups, have now become very big supporters of the State of Israel, when, a few decades ago, they were totally opposed to any kind of Jewish project. And so you've got to question their motives. You think, well, how come? Or, for instance, people, or think of some of our popular newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Sun and so on, that 20 years ago were absolutely opposed to issues around sexuality and so on, which now they say define Britishness. And if you disagree with them about their current liberal views about sexuality or feminism, you're somehow less than British or other than British. When, as recently as I think 1998, someone was showing me a Daily Mail article arguing that something was, gay political correctness and feminism gone mad and so on. So we see lots of arguments, as I got here on the slide. The right seems to have become converted to Israel and to feminism, but only when they have Muslims in their hair sites. And so one has to think, is that really the way of reasonable criticism? So if the answer to any of my 5 tests is a yes, then we may be dealing with Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. Thank you.